The year is 1983, and Frank Murphy is a Vietnam War veteran who flies helicopters for the Metropolitan Police Department in the city of Los Angeles. In his time off, he deals with his failed relationships and his fear of going crazy based on flashbacks he keeps getting to one traumatic incident in Vietnam. In the course of training his new co-worker, Richard Lymangood, played by Daniel Stern, Murphy witnesses what appears to be the planned murder of a city councilwoman. But when he tries to report his suspicions, he gets grounded, only to be brought into a top-secret project run by the police and the military entitled Blue Thunder, a super top-secret high-tech helicopter that has more purpose than we are led to believe. This is John Badham's Blue Thunder. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Okay, so I call this a dad movie, right? This is a movie that my dad loved. I appreciate the era that this film came out in because I feel it's something that we've gotten away from in the last 20 years. And that is a very mature, adult-oriented action film that lacks the whimsy and flair that modern action films have. We talked about John Wick a couple weeks ago in one of our episodes about how everything is flash, bang, stylistic, shaky camera, and there always has to be some kind of, operatic moment. There has to be some kind of classical music, bringing auteur flair and whimsy to a movie, when in the 70s and 80s, there was just this machismo to action films that just played it straight. We didn't need a lot of humor. We didn't need a lot of comic relief. We didn't need a lot of sex. We could just have an action film with drama, great characters, great beats, and it didn't have to really break our suspension of disbelief. We could go in and watch it and accept it for what it was and be entertained. And I feel that is something that modern action dramas lack. And this is a film that I think is a perfect example of that, with a star that I think is a perfect example of that kind of archetype. Blue Thunder, Roy Scheider. He's in Jaws. He's in all that jazz. He won Best Actor for You in our awards ceremony. This is the kind of guy I'm talking about, where he's not a tough guy. He's not a macho guy, but we believe in his ability to take control of the situation. And that's why I really appreciate this movie for what it is. What do you think?
100% agree, because you couldn't have picked this movie at a better time for me, because I just reviewed Carry On on Netflix. This one brought me back to the simplicities of entertainment, where you don't need that filler of special effects, the bangs, the booms, the explosions. We have that in this movie, but it's not overdone as filler. This is an action movie that is a pure definition of a popcorn flick, where you have a balance of characters we want to root for, the action scenes we want to engage with, and it doesn't overcomplicate itself. It's a very unique situation, and the situation doesn't work the characters work the situation, because we're equally invested in both. It has some cool moments, with the characters, it has some fun banter of dialogue. This is one of those movies of the 80s that you're absolutely right that we don't get more of nowadays, except for what we see in Carry On now. That is a good example of that. But this is one that you can literally sit down, turn your brain off, and still enjoy, but still be invested in what's happening on screen. And something that movies don't do now is, even though it's simplistic, it's memorable.
It's memorable, and it gets the job done without bogging itself down in runtime and without bogging itself down in drama. When we talked about pacing in movies, we've been talking about pacing a lot lately, how certain films just feel disjointed in their editing. Scrooge was one of the ones we talked about where it just kind of feels like it's a miracle it got put together. I think this is a masterclass in pacing because it really knows how to play those beats, and it doesn't outweigh its welcome. It doesn't even break like barely the 90-minute mark, but it gets everything done in the time allowed. It's got a really good villain who doesn't overstay his welcome, and we don't need 30 minutes of backstory on why the villain is the way he is. It's kind of intercut into the film of why these two are against each other. Malcolm McDowell, one of my favorite like villainous actors of all time. And like I said, he doesn't outstay his welcome. They really put the focus on the Murphy character and they give the film a vehicle. And that's what I love about movies like this. It could be a helicopter, it could be a tank, it could be a supercar, it could be whatever. It is kind of like the MacGuffin to keep the film moving without getting bogged down in character drama. They give us just enough so the characters have stakes, and then bringing those stakes into play with whatever the vehicle of the movie is. Like you said, it is a popcorn movie. It's not trying to be anything different than what it is. And I just have so much respect for films like that. One of the things I can say about the filmmaking too is that it's not glamorous. It is very urban. The fact that we are having these helicopter dogfights in the city, there's high stakes. You know, they complain about it in the review. We'll get to that in a minute. But I like the idea that we are taking pre-Top Gun, this idea of like aerial combat, but putting it in the city. And not only that, we're also playing with the ideas of the government conspiracy films of the 70s, like Parallax View and Marathon Man, but giving it a cool high-tech vehicle and an action film to tell a story too. Once again, there's just something about this era of filmmaking before that big budget blockbuster transition of the mid 80s that we had a nice little window of films like this.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of going into like 2005 Stealth that tried to do kind of the same thing that just flawed and blew up disastrously. This is
Yeah,
where it
yeah.
actually gets it right. And don't get me wrong, popcorn movies have flaws. They do. And this movie does have flaws, but it's what leads up to these flaws makes it so do we care or do we not? And this one makes it so we don't care about the flaws because it really doesn't matter. We have unbelievable moments in this. We have things that we could say, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? But it doesn't matter when it comes to a film like this because the characters are more relevant than the actual cliches. The actual situations are more relevant than the actual cliches of the actions that we see. So, and that's what makes this a perfect popcorn flick because we don't question ourselves because the ride is too fun. We see the fun pacing that you see. It flies by like no other. The editing is on par, which is why it got an Oscar nomination because this is where it really does show the technical aspects of it to really show the challenging between inside a helicopter to the dogfights of the suburban areas, where this really does determine how well this movie is going to be perceived by the actual technical aspects. And I think that
Mhm.
is part of the engagement that we see. We're invested in following along with these characters, like holding your arms up in a roller coaster. So I did a rewatch last night for I think it was my second rewatch, and my body was swaying towards the areas of where the helicopter was going.
Yeah,
And that is
me
the
too. Me too.
beauty of the filmmaking here is even though this is a movie from the 80s and I'm watching it on a TV in my living room, I'm still engaged with the actions of what our characters are doing. And that is one of the most brilliant aspects of this movie is really engaging the audience in not just the performances and the situation, but the technical aspects of it.
Let's talk since we're on that subject. Let's talk about that before we get into like the characters and the performance and the storytelling. 100%. Like I watch this on my big screen downstairs, and I like to sit up closer down there. And there's only two movies that make me feel the way that you just said, where there are moments where like the helicopter pulls back or it sways, and I'm not like in a D box moving chair. I'm just in my little floor couch, but I pull back. I like move my body with the movie. This and Maverick Top Gun 2 are the only two films I've ever seen that actually made my body physically react to what I was seeing on the screen. Star Wars didn't do it for me. The first Top Gun didn't do it for me. Days of Thunder a little bit because there's so much like adrenaline in those racing scenes, but yeah, there's a magic to the filmmaking here. And John Badham as a director, I've always liked the guy, but it's so weird. Like he's a mixed bag of a director. He's a journeyman. Saturday Night Fever, then he did this and War Games in the same year, and then Short Circuit like 2 years later. Like, what a weird mixed bag of films to put in there. But one of the things I like about his filmmaking is no matter how ridiculous the story, there's definitely an element of realism in all of it. You know, like War Games, it's a teen movie about nuclear war and hacking computers, but the suspension of disbelief is there, but technically on film, the filmmaking, the pacing of it, it makes you feel engaged. We talked about Short Circuit. We like part two better, but there's something dangerous feeling about the first one. Like the military aspect, the fact that these robots are deadly. It's a sci-fi comedy, but there is a realism to it. And that's what I felt about this movie is I felt that this film could actually be something that could happen. Even though it's outlandish in its storytelling and its plot structure, the idea that there could be a super high-tech military helicopter brought in for urban pacification that just gets out of control and put in the wrong hands, yeah, 100%. And I buy it. So like the script might be great, but technically I buy it.
It's borderline fantasy and realism, and that's what I
Yeah,
really enjoyed about John Badham's, storytelling because you're right, he does have kind of a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, it is audience pleasing. When we get to one of my favorite movies, Stakeout, that is one that is just
another one.
so
Mhm.
engaging that he understands the audience. No matter what movie he does, it really does show a tribute to the ones that watch it because he has certain nuggets in his films that do have a social commentary almost, but at the same time, he's not going to give that up for the audience engagement. This is a summer blockbuster director, and some of his movies may not be a blockbuster, but the intent of being a blockbuster is there because whether it's popular at the time, it becomes popular in time. And that's what I really appreciate about how he approaches his movies is he really does go for the fun factor of it, of mere entertainment with a subtle foundation of social commentary. And we see that a lot here when it comes to privacy, government interference. We see all of that here, but the characters outshine what the social commentary is in entertainment value. So it's almost like it's hypnotic of what they're trying to tell us. But at the same time, it is brilliant filmmaking. It's a brilliant directed film when it comes to how this story is told.
I like what you said about, the recognizing what the audience wants and pleasing the audience because I do think that is something lost in filmmaking as the theatrical experience has become less important to people. Like I love auteurs as much as the next guy. So do you. We like Paul Thomas Anderson and Tarantino and stuff like that. But there is a difference when you see filmmakers that are making films for them or their ilk, and then when you see filmmakers that are making films for the audience. And I think that is something that Tom Cruise recognized with Maverick, and working with that director over and over again. Same with like when he works with Christopher McQuarrie, that there are still filmmakers that care about what the audience expectation and satisfaction is, not just having a film that's supposed to like, ooh, I can't go home and not think about this one. Like they're not way homers. They are there to give you an entertainment experience. And I feel that's what Badham does, especially in this one. And I got to give him credit too, because the original script by Dan O'Bannon for this, Dan O'Bannon of Alien fame and Dead and Buried and Return of the Living Dead, essentially it was supposed to be like a Rambo story where Murphy was supposed to be a helicopter policeman in LA whose shell shock and trauma from Vietnam kind of makes him go crazy, steal this helicopter and go on a murderous rampage. And Badham was like, no, we've seen that movie. That's Rambo. Like, we've seen that happen. What if we make the character likable? And what if we give him a bad guy? And what if we make it an intriguing conspiracy film too? He took a good concept and he turned it into a popcorn movie when the original intent was supposed to be like a thought piece, right? Like, oh, these people are supposed to be protecting us, but because of their shell shock trauma from war, now they're using high tech machinery against us. It's been played to death. So being able to turn that concept into this, I think, is even more impressive. And yeah, when we get to the reviews of it, the one critic agrees, and the other one, we'll get to that.
Bannon and Jacoby, they do something brilliant here, and we've seen it from movies past. And to me, this is the perfect team up of writers where we have a little bit of the critical thinking. We have a lot of the entertainment value from these writers that we've seen from them in the past. This one really does kind of touch on different topics, and it allows the viewer to explore that in their own time. But it still shows that this is an in control movie of where it wants to go. It's going to give you nuggets along the way to follow the trail of whatever you want to think. It gives almost a simplistic critical thinking, if I want to kind of put it that way, of allowing you.
It makes you feel smarter than.
It doesn't go too deep and spoon feeding you this conspiracy theory. You know it's there and you get the plot points to move the story along, but it doesn't focus on it because that's not what this movie is about. It's a good mix of the conspiracy along with the action, and that's how it's written. And I think the crescendo of how it gets there is good. I do have problems with the climax. I don't like the climax on it, but at the same time, everything before that is on a good pace of how a popcorn movie should be. And I have huge problems, and we've seen that from the Bourne movies. We've seen that from movies that try to be thrillers and character-driven thrillers or spy thrillers, whatever it may be, that really do over talk. They over explain, and it just becomes tiresome.
Well, there's so many like boardroom, conference room discussions in those movies that take you out of the action. And I get why they do that. They want to feel like they are more I don't know, esoteric and intelligent to be just considered an action movie. But at the end of the day, we just want to see a goddamn action movie. We don't need to see Brian Cox or Chris Cooper or David Strathairn or Joan Allen talk for 30 minutes in a conference room about why Bourne is dangerous. Like that's the same shit we see in every movie. And this was you're reading my mind tonight because this leads me to my best point. This movie has formulaic and stereotypical characters, and it's all the better for it. So, for example, Warren Oates is the police chief, right? He is the same goddamn police chief that we've seen in every action movie of the 70s, of pretty much every action movie of the 80s, who's like, get in my office now. You blew up the city. God damn it. The mayor's down my throat. If it's not broken, don't fix it. That character is there for a reason. It is there to create that sense of relationship between, the loose cannon cop and the people who are running the city. And that's all we need. We don't need a 20-minute conversation in a boardroom or a conference room about why Murphy is a loose cannon. No, that Warren Oates character is perfect. The little snivelly guys with the bow ties who are like the government, black men in black, essentially. They don't overstand their welcome either. They're there to be creepy, suspicious, but they don't take away from the story. And then the villain himself, Malcolm McDowell, as Cochrane. Again, he is just peppered in there perfectly and written well, but performed better. Because to have a villain with that little amount of screen time, but still be memorable and dislikable, that is a very, very strong achievement for a film like this, where he's in the movie for like maybe less than 10 minutes, but he feels like he's omnipotent and present there the whole time. Again, that is another great part of this movie that I think gets overlooked. Like, you don't need a villain to do the pinky thing the whole time. Like, he can show up and just be villainous for like 30 seconds and then fuck off. And then you're back to the story, and then the stakes get higher throughout. Again, it's a stupid action movie from the 80s, but I think it's so high tier in the way its delivery method is.
No, you're 100% right, because a lot of the pre-production went into, you talked about the characters. These are throwaway characters. These are formula characters that we don't need a lot. These are filmmakers that understand that, and it's not how these characters present themselves in the movie. It's who is delivering the lines to execute it to the level to still make it engaging. And all the entire cast does it extremely well, especially I agree. Malcolm McDowell, he plays the villain extremely well. He takes advantage of every single piece of dialogue, from the looks, the mannerisms, the just the you love to hate him kind of feel.
The smugness,
It's
right?
just
Yeah.
that is the relatability of the audience that everybody hates, is just that smugness to them. So I think the post production of building up and getting the right people in the right roles is what really made this movie a really big success, because they understood that this was going to be a formula movie with kind of a high tech feel, and they nailed it. So I think it was post production that led up to this that really made this movie successful, and they were right in the decisions of the casting.
I mean, so let's continue with the casting then. We talked a little bit of shit on Daniel Stern in the Little Monsters episode, but I think for this, he is like the perfect amalgamation of what this dude is. He's not a helicopter cop. He's like a street cop detective that wants to try something new. He's kind of nerdy. He's kind of goofy. He is the perfect juxtaposition to what Roy Scheider's character is. And it is almost like a Kohai Senpai relationship, right? Where I don't think Murphy cares who he's training. He's just training dudes all the time. This guy, though, got involved in this conspiracy with him. So now they have a cohesive relationship where generally I don't think they would. But the stakes of the movie put them together, and it makes both of their existence and their actions be complementary of each other. And again, that's another great thing, because Lyman Good, his character doesn't really seem that important until it does, and it's kind of sneaky how they do it. He's Jaffo. He's just another fucking observer. And then when you realize that he's more than that, he actually has knowledge and smarts and is actually the key component of getting the videotapes out of this super tech helicopter that Frank Murphy would never know how to do. That is great development. The goofy ass guy actually is valuable to the story and valuable to the plot progression, where in the moments of tragedy, we actually have an empathy for this character because we've grown to like him and we've grown to respect what his part of this story is. Once again, that is an archetype that we don't see anymore. I feel like now screenwriters feel like everyone who speaks has to be important right from the beginning, and that creates a bogginess in your storytelling, and you don't care about the characters at all. I'm going on a tangent here, but like bodies, bodies, bodies. I liked the movie, but I hated that how everyone had to have so much to say when it really meant nothing, right? I feel that's a lot of movies these days. This doesn't do that. Again, like the progression of these characters is perfect.
100% agree. And when we take a lot of this chemistry, and again, we can go back to the writers on this that really do have the expertise into pulling in this care, this empathy into this chemistry, how we're loving what the action and the dialogue's happening on screen. And to an extent with Daniel Stern, this is his early roles. And I think he does a fantastic job, to the point that I wanted more from him. And I think if
Yeah.
I were to nitpick, as just if I would have made the movie, I would have loved to see more of that dialogue, that chemistry, while they're doing that first helicopter run, and seeing some more
Mhm.
banter, not just explaining what the helicopter does and all the technical aspects. I think if I were to kind of just give a nitpick on it, other than the climax that I was not happy with, I would say that we focused too much on the technology, and we almost lost a little bit of the humanity when it comes to this chemistry. And I think there was a lot more there that would have added to that big scene where we should feel something big with Daniel Stern, that it
Mhm.
actually took me back a little bit, because I feel internally that I needed more to actually feel
I agree.
something. So that would be my biggest nitpick, I would say, with this film.
That is such a hard conversation to have, because when you are a studio that puts in millions of dollars into constructing these high-tech helicopters which actually flew, you need to show off what you're doing. You need to show off the technology. So I can see how that would be a thing. It's like, let's do a little bit less of the characters and let's show more of the goddamn helicopter. And someone asked Malcolm McDowell in an interview about this, because Roy Scheider was asked about, dealing with Jaws and the shark. It's like, do you guys feel that you were outperformed and outweighed by a mechanical shark? That's all people talk about. And Malcolm McDowell, he's like, a lot of people won't work with technology, animals, or children. He's like, but I love it, because it brings you more attention if you can make people angry at you for exploiting the animal, the technology, or the child. So it is interesting that Roy Scheider is like, I'm just an actor and I just acted with that helicopter. But Malcolm McDowell embraced it. He's like, no, like if that helicopter wasn't in the movie, then my bad guy has no purpose. And I was able to be a better bad guy because of the tech. I thought that was a really great answer. And again, that's an actor who understands what's on the page.
I get it. And to me, it sounds like a press release answer, but at the same time, I get it. So, but that's where it separates for a lot of movies from how we interact, because I hate to use this aspect of Jurassic Park, but I'm going to do it, even though it's not appropriate in this movie. The technology versus the human characters. So all eyes are on the dinosaurs versus the human characters when we're all live. And when we have Daniel Stern flipping switches and the camera has to zoom in on these switches just to
Mhm.
demonstrate this, instead of focusing on the reactions of the joy of this technology, that's kind of where I have that nitpick, if I were to be real, because there's no real care for me to see the name of a switch. I care about the reaction of how we're reacting to this technology. So you can zoom in on gray and black, red, green buttons. I don't care, because I want to see the joy and the excitement, or the fear to some, of how this technology is used. So I can understand both sides of it, but at the end of the day, when it comes to being interactive with the audience, I think that was the bare miss, is focusing too much on this of, look what I can do with this spectacle, the biggest high budget thing in this movie, versus something that a human can connect to.
And this is 1983. Like this is before the days of, the internet really. And I've seen this movie so many times. I know it backwards and forwards, but this watch in particular, it reminded me of a film that I think is very similar in its message, maybe not its execution, and that was the movie Eagle Eye that Shia LaBeouf was in. We're kind of dealing with the same thing where it's like, okay, like this is an invasion of privacy, but instead of a helicopter, it's a supercomputer that actually can control weaponry and stuff like that. I feel like that's this plot elevated. And it actually made me appreciate Eagle Eye even more than I did the first time, because I recognized so much of it in this film, just like in the DNA of it. So, yeah, again, like being able to make an action film that satiates your action appetite, but also be clever enough to have conspiracy and government plotting, but not be too smart for its own good, I think is the overall message that I have for this movie, is that, like, hey, it's just a good, entertaining popcorn flick, like our critics say, and it's kicking off the year with my first pick of this new season. I only put this on here because I wanted to get to it eventually, and I'm kind of glad I got it out of the way early, because now I can move on to the things I haven't seen, because I got that last one out of the way of, like, this is something I really, really like.
I think it's a great pick, because we talk a lot on this show about the intent. What is the intent of a film? Just because you don't like it, was the filmmaker's vision's intent executed? And this is one
Yeah.
that is 100% yes. This knew what it exactly wanted to be. It knew who it wanted to entertain. And this is a movie that was just pure, well, just executed as just one of those popcorn flicks. So it's an entertaining film. It's a well made, given 83, going up against, I think the release time was Return of the Jedi 2, which is a
Hmm.
bold move for a movie like this, was just overlooked. And I think it actually did do what it needed to do. On those that didn't want to go see Return of the Jedi, they wanted to see something a little more subtle, but extremely fun.
No, 83 was a fun year. Like, maybe sometime we should focus on 1983 for a month, because there's some really good stuff in there. And I don't honestly know all of the critiques of 1983 that they've done. I've only listened to the ones that we've kind of picked out. So the the boys have a little bit of a debate on this one, and it's not a very super long conversation. Gene brought it to the show, and Gene feels very similar to the way we feel about it.
Blue Thunder is a rousing good adventure story with a brand new action hero, but it's not Roy Scheider who stars in the film. The star of Blue Thunder is a powerful new space-age helicopter packed with all sorts of surveillance equipment and firepower. Scheider plays a veteran Los Angeles cop who sees the Blue Thunder copter as something bad. Malcolm McDowell plays an old Army adversary of Scheider who sees the copter as an evil ally. This movie isn't good because of its social message. Blue Thunder is a great movie to gobble popcorn by. The weaponry, the one man against the system story, all of that combines into making Blue Thunder a perfect summertime entertainment. I had a great time with this picture.
So one of the things I can say about his critique is it's, several years before, but very similar to his critique of RoboCop, where it is a popcorn movie, turn off your brain, who gives a shit about the plot? Yes, it is trying to make a social message, but it's doing it by being entertaining. That is something that I feel Gene is very hit and miss on. But when it hits, he's right. I think he was totally right on RoboCop, and I think he's totally right on this one.
I think I agree with everything, but I hated the comment of the true star of the movie is a helicopter.
Right.
That is my only problem with it, because I was more focused, and again, interpretation. I was more focused on the character reactions of flying the device or the reactions of an explosion of a building, how these characters are going to react to what this technology does. The true star isn't the helicopter. And I think that is where people are going to go to when they watch this movie, as I spoke to earlier, because we get so many up close shots of the listening device, the buttons, the whatever it may be. And it's a misinterpretation of what the intent is, because the filmmakers want this to be a character-driven thriller with a prop. That's it.
A mechanism. It needs a mechanism.
Absolutely. And I think, but 100% right with Gene on everything else. It is an entertainment piece of it. It's a popcorn flick. It does what it needs to do, as we've discussed. But I think how he got entertained by it, I think he was in awe of the technology. And I think he kind of missed the boat on what made this helicopter so enjoyable.
Well, and then, yeah, because mechanism movies do have struggles if they only focus on the mechanism, right? So like if it's a tank movie that only focuses on the tank and not the people who are building it, running it, whatever, it's a very thin line where you are just essentially marketing a prop instead of building a story around it. Like if this was a licensed film, let's say if Blue Thunder had been a video game or a toy line or something like that, it could play the exact same way as it does, but it would be interpreted differently than it is, because that already exists in the zeitgeist. That mechanism already has a fan base and an expectation, and it will create either a sense of appreciation or disappointment to people that are already attached to that. But it's not. This was an original story with an original mechanism, and that changes it. So I think that's where it can get away with it, because no one knew what Blue Thunder was. No one knew about, I don't even think Apache helicopters were like in the mainstream at this point. We just knew of helicopters as the news helicopter or like the Huey choppers in Vietnam. Like that's all we really knew. And high-tech helicopters weren't quite a thing. And this kind of like broke the mold on that. So again, it's a mechanism that gets the plot going, but it's got a great story and character base around it.
Well, and I also think that as we get into this review, this was, again, summer. It was with Return of the Jedi. And I think he focused a lot this week on the technology aspect. Again, we go with Return of the Jedi. That one was a spectacle. And summer movies are a spectacle. And it's hard to get as a critic to get out of that mode. And they spoke a ton on their show about summer movies, on how they're just spectacles. But then we get reviews like
hated
this.
Summer movies.
Yeah, they get reviews like this where they focus on the spectacle or the prop or the mechanism, whatever it may be, of what should make this movie special, but they always miss what really does drive the special effects, which is going to be the characters.
I mean, they're a year ahead of 1984, which most people acknowledge as like the year of the summer blockbuster, where summer blockbuster expectations like became a thing from that point on. And that's when you did see the turn in them, where like, oh great, another summer full of useless marketable blockbusters. So yeah, maybe if this came out in 86, they wouldn't have felt the same way about it, or at least Gene wouldn't have. But Roger does have a contrarian opinion.
I didn't like it quite as much as you did, and I know you love the flying, and I thought the flying was pretty good too, but if you think about a Clint Eastwood picture like Firefox, I think that had better aerial dogfights than this movie does. And there's another thing, and it's our old friend plausibility. At the end of this film, when they go on the air, the television newscast, and they say, I'm not going to spoil. I'm going to say this much. They're saying because of this tape that we have, we've reopened the investigation into the death of the city commissioner. Yeah. I'm thinking, gee, that's an interesting story to lead the newscast with. How about the fact that the Air Force just shot down 2 skyscrapers? How about putting that on the
plausibility? Like, that's where Roger's hit and miss too, because sometimes he tells Gene to stop looking for logic in your movies and just have fun, and they flip the tables on this one. My biggest thing about this particular debate is Roger saying that Firefox has better aerial dogfights and effects than Blue Thunder does. No, it doesn't. Firefox is all blue screen and models, and it looks like it. And all of the cockpit footage in Firefox is obvious blue screen. It may have held up back then, but it does not now. 3/4 of the helicopter stuff in this movie is real footage. Roy Scheider actually took off and landed in that helicopter for those shots. It's really him flying, taking off and landing, and there's tons of actual aerial footage of them flying through the city. It is so impressive now. When I was watching it just the other day, and I'm like, they're literally chasing each other in helicopters 50 feet off the ground through the middle of Los Angeles. You wouldn't see something like that anymore. It would all be CG. It is so impressive of the old school conventional way of filmmaking, practical and real, that there was just something visceral about watching this again. And I grew up with this movie on like a little TV screen, watching it big, man. I was like, they really did that shit. I was so impressed by that flying stuff.
Well, this is what makes practical effects so effective, because we see it in the direction here is we're following the headshots inside the cockpit of Roy Schneider just looking as the camera's going by. We're following him with looking at the landscapes. When we have green screen, blue screen, whatever it may be, we don't get that reaction. We get quick edits here and there of the scenic, then inside of a up close shot of the reaction. So the the actual direction here is what makes it special and believable. Even McDowell, he hated flying, but he had to get into a helicopter for this movie. And
yeah, he would like throw up before and throw up after each day.
And those reactions are the best reactions because it's raw and real. That's what makes it believable. But in Roger's defense, here's what I'll say is he has a point on the missiles flying through buildings at the end, but this is what I go to before is it's earned the right to be ridiculous when it comes to the last 15 minutes. Is you have all this build, you have all this entertainment value. At that point, if you want to throw in something formula and ridiculous, be my guest, because it's not going to affect my opinion of how the rest of the movie is. He has a point, but at the same time, it doesn't matter because it's earned the right to be a ridiculous popcorn movie, even if it's just for a 15-second shot.
You took the words right out of my mouth, is that this film earns its right to, like I said, extend that suspension of disbelief. The plausibility which he is preaching, the film has earned its place to do that. And it would be a completely different story if we had a slog through 80 minutes of bullshit storytelling and character development to get a cool dogfight. And we've seen movies like that. Like there's movies where it's like, I'm going to skip 80 minutes of this movie and just watch the end because that's the only part that's any fun. You know, and this movie doesn't do that. So yes, I agree with you.
I think that I just sat there and it was a new, when Jaws came out, we thought about sharks differently. Yeah. Now this is a picture that has a helicopter as its star, and it was kind of fun.
And now I think about helicopters the way I used to think about sharks.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Nothing, but...
Okay, and I don't think so much is wrong with the movie.
Okay, difference of opinion.
Yeah, Gene actually got him there. It's like, yeah, well, that's a stupid thing to say. Like, what's wrong with that? When are you actually going to fly a helicopter, Roger?
The big problem here is Roger, I've given a lot of respect to and a lot of leeway to when it comes to going into the fantasy, buying into the movie. And it feels like if it's not sci-fi, he doesn't give any leeway to of that disbelief of just sitting back and enjoying the roller coaster. So you can ride a Disneyland ride and and try and analyze how it's going so fast or why we need to be secured in a seatbelt. But at the end of the ride, you're laughing and having fun with it. So this is kind of the disbelief that makes it okay. But I will go into this is the climax on how it ends is absolutely ridiculous. I know I've been giving nuggets of how my dissatisfaction of this climax, but to me, I feel like this was just cut off too short, where it earned even more so the right to kind of just explain itself a little bit more or to give an ending result.
I mean, like, there's a part of me that wishes it was like a Shane ending, right? Like, he just flies off into the sunset and we don't know what happens, right? I think that could have been very poignant as well. But we've grown to like this guy so much, the filmmaker essentially owes us a clean slate for him, right? And that's what they kind of give us in a very short, truncated epilogue, you could say, you know? So I get what you're saying, and I agree with that. But also, Roger didn't like action films as much as Gene did. You know, like we did Long Kiss Goodnight a few weeks ago, and Gene was very complimentary of it, and Roger was just like, yeah, well, I mean, like we've seen this movie a dozen times, and if it wasn't for Quentin Tarantino, movies like this wouldn't exist. It's like, okay, well, shut up. That's not true. He just didn't have as much fun with it, which we still haven't done the Speed 2 episode yet, but that's another one where it's like, I feel like both of their credibility took a major hit with how much they liked that movie. Maybe I'm just giving too much away because I know we'll cover that eventually, but at least I think in these earlier days, I'm going to say like the 80s when action films became more of a prevalent thing up until the mid 90s, Gene was more complimentary about solid action films than Roger was. And Roger, I think, was a little bit more forgiving of quirky horror comedies than Gene was. Pick your poison, man. That's just the way they were.
This is where Roger really doesn't understand, I think, the action genre, and he's too logical with it. We're going to go into the Speed 2 review, but even in that review, and I'm sure we're going to reference this episode when we talk about that one, is he's he's so logical on even what prints out on a computer screen, and it shouldn't matter because that's not the intent of a single half a second shot of going over and judging a movie for that. You have movies that are just ludicrous action movies that are just gunfire, have a good time, and it's just loud. You have those that just are goofy with a great chemistry that build to something that's just engaging to watch. And you have this movie that kind of balances a little bit of all the subgenres into one. And we don't need, just because it has technology in it, doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to be real. It just has to be fun. People don't go to action movies to see and expect a documentary. They go to be entertained. And I think that's where Roger really faults on action movies. He likes it logical, he likes it real, and he wants it believable. And if it stirs from the course that way, it's not a great movie. But then we get the contradiction, as we'll get into some action reviews later in this year, that he contradicts himself on that.
Yes, he does. I mean, I haven't even started taking notes on the contradictions. Maybe I should, but I don't have enough paper. Okay, so I mean, like I've already praised this movie. You've already praised this movie. I think that it is a definite anchor point of the 1980s of what an action film could and should be. And when we do start getting into later 80s, we do, and we've talked about them already on this show, how some of these action films just feel bloated. Like they forgot that they can just be a 90-minute action film, not get too involved with characters. We don't have to know everyone's fucking backstory. This does it perfectly. So I don't know if there are any filmmakers out there. There's a rumor that Christopher Nolan was like thinking about making a Blue Thunder remake. I hear that it's more of like an homage to it, where it's like urban helicopter cops, not necessarily Blue Thunder. But I mean, that movie would not exist, in my opinion, if it wasn't for Blue Thunder. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I think this is definitely a lesson that someone needs to go back and revisit and say, we can make action movies like this again that feel adult, that feel mature, that don't have to dumb down or glamorize violence like John Wick does to capture that teenage audience. Make action movies for adults again, the way that people are making romances and dramas and quirky comedies for adults again. Like, we don't have to make movies for everybody. We can pick our audience and just do a good job telling a story for that audience.
I'll be bold and say this movie cannot be made today because it is impossible, mainly for the fact that the temptation of CGI, the temptation of just going all technical and ignoring the characters on it we've seen it. And again, I use the example of 2005 Stealth, is we have this technical aspect and obsession that we can only be entertained by the spectacle we see on screen, and actual humans cannot entertain us. And when we take the temptation of a high-tech helicopter, that's all you have to entertain studios to say, we need a big budget. And that's what the problem is going to be with remaking a movie like this. And I really do hope, and I'm not against remakes or reboots or anything like that. I like another vision, but this is a movie that will stray too far to the temptation of ignoring what made this movie too special.
I agree. I agree. Like again, the best way I can explain it is that this is almost like a kids movie for grown-ups. Like it does play to all the notes of adventure, of high stakes, but it makes it mature. Very mature. I mean, there's like moments of like extreme nudity in this movie that kind of seem out of place, but I like it because it belongs there. It explains what these guys are doing when there's no crimes to stop, right? They're going to peep through windows and watch naked yoga girls. I'm like, okay, yeah, I get that. That's something that if someone didn't have a smartphone back then to look at porn on, this is what they would go to, right? Yeah, 100%. I love this movie. So I can't not be complimentary of Gene's review because he essentially echoes everything I think about it. So I'm going to give the man an A. I think he hit all the notes because he understood what this movie was.
When it comes to Roger, I don't think we get enough context from it. And even in his written review, it's so logical and is just boring in comparison to the movie. So when I'm reading a review or watching him, I don't want to hear logic. I want to hear if the film did what it was supposed to do. And Gene did nail that, and Roger didn't. He focused on maybe holistically a 2-minute runtime of ridiculousness that it absolutely earned leading up to it. So I don't think this was one of Roger's best reviews at all. And I think it actually it contradicts exactly what this movie is supposed to do, especially with audiences wanting a movie like this. So it's going to be a solid 1.5 stars for me.
Yeah, when you're only focusing on the plausibility of an action movie, you've lost me already. Like the whole idea of the action film is that the plausibility shouldn't be a concern, right? Like maybe Die Hard ruined action movies for some people because, oh, that could really happen. He's not wearing shoes and terrorists could take over a building and blah, blah, blah. But give me a Commando any day. Give me a Running Man any day. They're cheesy and their plausibility is at 0, but the entertainment factor is there. And that's all I care about when I go into an action movie like this.
Not only that, but the movie leads up, and even though I complained about it, it does give everything that Roger was probably looking for. It gives a focus around the technology. It gives what this copter can do, and it leads up and to a technical thirst for Roger that it seems like that's what he was looking for. But the realism of a singular missile or going into a building for the outcome just kind of ruined that for him. But that's what this helicopter can do. So everything else is in place except he didn't like the climax, just like me, but I can overlook a lot of the faults of this movie to understand what the intent of this movie was doing.
Okay, so for next week, Justin's pick, I think is very fascinating because it is one of those love it or hate it films. I'm going to say that this is a film that like pretentious film boys like, but the general audience just don't know how to make head or tails of it. So what do our critics make of it? And that is David Cronenberg's Naked Lunch, starring Peter Weller. So I'm glad you picked that one. I got my Criterion right behind me. I can't wait to dig into that and see what these guys have to say about it.
This is one that I think has gotten more and more distant if I were to put my opinion on it. And I think this is a great season to bring this one to the table because it's a great revisit.
Well, it's also the Cronenberg film that like scares people. Like there's lots of Cronenberg films that people are just like, okay, I know what this is and I like it, blah, blah, blah. However, this and his film Crash, I think, are very divisive with certain audiences, especially the ones that like him for what he was. Like, don't go into this film thinking you're going to see The Fly or Videodrome. That's not what this is. So, yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation.
And I haven't even said if I liked it or not, so this is going to be even a better conversation going into next week.
I have no idea what your opinion on this one. I mean, you know I must like it if it's on my shelf, but the question is, why do I like it?
It's a great question.
We'll get into that. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching, listening. Please rate, review 5 stars. Not only to Back to the Balcony, but also my show, The Cult Worthy Cinema Podcast. You can find me at thecultworthy.com, and my co-host, Justin Henson, you can find him over at
themoviewire.com.
Please send us your suggestions. We've got 3 episodes in a row coming up that are all listener requests, and boy, are they fun. We got Captain Ron, we've got Ernest Goes to Camp, and we've got The Thing. 3 movies from our listeners that we are going to be covering, and we got a good month of content coming up.
And I think 2 of those were like Academy Award winners, right?
Right, 100%. Captain Ron, best actor, right? Best mullet, you should say. All right. I will see you next week.
See you next week.